So one of the biggest issues to the business community is workforce. The Kentucky Chamber just released our workforce report where we detailed a lot of the challenges being faced by the business community when it comes to the workforce and workforce training programs in the state. And one of the recommendations in the report was that the next governor take a top to bottom look at the system and bring in an outside entity to review the system before even finalizing cabinet structure of the administration. How do you feel about that request, and how would you handle it?
Well, I will take that request in consideration. Will largely comply with it, to be honest with you. Workforce development is an issue that I've been talking about for several years now, and I really appreciate the Chamber's involvement, and they're making recommendations. And I agree with the Chamber that the cabinet structure needs to be changed. We almost need to step back and say, okay, what do we want our workforce to look like, and then redesign it and figure out, does the workforce development cabinet in its current structure, is it meeting our needs? How does the workforce development cabinet interface with the Kentucky community and technical college system? How do we maximize the new workforce innovation grants that are coming? So all those recommendations coming from the Chamber are very well received on our end, and when I'm the next governor, by and large, I will adhere to those. We are going to redesign the cabinet. I have been saying out on the campaign trail, Jacqueline, as I travel across the state, that the next workforce development secretary needs to be just as important as the economic development secretary. And that hasn't always been the case in Frankfort, because when businesses are thinking about coming to our Commonwealth, they want to know what the tax structure is, they want to know what the quality of life is, and then they need to know about their workforce. And we have a real skills gap in this state, Jacqueline, we really do. I was, right now here in Louisville, where we're taping this interview, you can go down to the Louisville assembly plant and they can't find enough skilled electricians for their expansion down there, and they're paying $27 an hour. Or a few months ago, I was in Henderson at a tool and die shop where they were making, it was advanced manufacturing, and they were making the molds for auto parts. And the CEO was paying his employees about $100,000 a year, had 50 employees, was running this facility 24/7 in 3 separate shifts, and he was looking for 50 more employees and couldn't find them. Same story throughout central Kentucky, yet we could go to eastern Kentucky and go through counties that have near 20% unemployment, and you can see and feel the despair as people don't have jobs, and jobs that have been in their families for generations are no longer around. So this is a big conversation, and it's one that we have to get right, and it's one that I'm committed to getting right.
Now, you talk about how big workforce is to you, and obviously in your jobs plan, it's one of the top things,
Yes.
Building the best workforce. And you suggest we do a statewide apprenticeship program.
Mm-hmm.
How do we go about doing that, and what do you think are the most important skills that need to be taught in that type of system?
Well, I mean, the Chamber has identified that some of the most important skills to be taught are the soft skills, excuse me. Being on time, being polite, being able to interface with others. I mean, I think that is very, very important. We have to work with men and women in labor as well as the Chamber to make certain that we're designing an apprenticeship program that meets the needs of local employers. And we also need to do a better job, Jacqueline, in when kids are 16, 17, and 18, that both the teenagers and their parents understand what opportunities are out there. Does it make sense to take out a large loan for 4 years of college? What could they potentially make if they were to enter into an apprenticeship program? We need to do a better job of putting that information out on the table and letting young people and their families make decisions for themselves. I've been in and around Frankfort for a while now. It was nearly 20 years ago when I worked with Governor Patton, and we had higher education reform, and they were his ideas, but I wrote the bill out. And what we were trying to do there is we were trying to take the community colleges from the University of Kentucky, pair them with the technical schools, have them share resources, and be responsive to the needs of local employers. One of the things we have to do in higher education reform or in workforce reform is to take a good look at the KCTCS as well and see if on a college by college basis or a school by school basis, are they really meeting the needs of local employers? Because in many cases they're not.
Well, that's a good segue into education. In our primary voter guide, you were the only one of 6 candidates to say that you supported Common Core. Now, you have said that if there are changes that need to be made, you're willing to make them. Have you heard from people about any specific changes that they want to see made to these standards in the state?
I think Common Core is a hugely misunderstood issue. The people that talk against Common Core often say, oh, it's a federal takeover of local education. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the states designed the Common Core standards because they were concerned at the local level that they needed to have their students be better prepared for college or for careers. So college and career readiness was the goal of Common Core. And look, it's not perfect. We need more local control. And if something needs to be changed, we can change it. But over the last 6 or 7 years, by Kentucky's own statistics, we've gone from having 31% of our students be college or career ready to about 54% of our students being college or career ready. That's a big leap. That's a big leap in 6 or 7 years. And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So if we do need to make some tweaks here or there, or if teachers aren't satisfied with what they're teaching in the classroom, or if they want to teach more engineering and mathematics and maybe they're not doing that, you hear that sometimes, maybe we need to do that. But just to rail against Common Core and claim it's a federal takeover of education when it's really not, it seems to me like you're being disingenuous with the public when you do that.
Now, another education issue that's being discussed in this race is charter schools. In our primary voter guide, you said that you would be open to the idea of charter schools if they didn't take away funding from public schools and were held to the same standards. The bill that was pushed in 2015 would have had public charter schools through pilot projects, and from what I understand, it would have likely met that criteria. Is that something you would have signed or vetoed if you were governor?
Oh, I have to go back and review the bill. I don't know. I'm not going to say what I'm going to sign or what I'm going to veto. I would say that if you've got innovation, if you have pilot programs, I can support the concept of a charter school as long as it's within the context of public education and we're creating competition within public education. I also want it to be transparent. So if we're throwing off the shackles of bureaucracy and encouraging our schools to innovate and do a better job, I can support that. As Attorney General, I've been the leader amongst my colleagues in going after some of the for-profit colleges, for example, that have been more interested in getting their hands on federal student loan dollars than they have been in actually training people and putting them in jobs. You talk about a workforce issue, there's one. What I don't like in charter schools are what's happened in some states where you have for-profit companies coming in, siphoning off public dollars, making a profit for themselves, and cherry-picking students and creating a more permanent underclass in other areas of education. I don't like that. So the devil's in the details with charter schools, so I would want to see the bill. But if you're talking about being innovative and transparent within the context of public education and not siphoning off public dollars, then I can support that.
Okay, now the biggest financial threat facing the state is obviously the underfunding of our public pension systems. We made some legislative changes, which you've discussed before, and it's not going to be fixed overnight. But you've also said that you are not in favor of bonding. So what specific changes or reforms would you push for to make sure that the systems are solvent going forward?
Well, we have to monitor the changes that have been made. People are going to have to work longer for current and future hires. We're going to have to make certain we have the proper contributions going into the system. We have adhered to the recommendations of the Pew Foundation for the States, which said that the state needed to go to the hybrid system of part defined benefit and part defined contribution. I agree with that. But we got into this mess, Jacqueline, over 15 to 20 years when in Frankfurt we didn't make the contribution, or they didn't make the contribution that was necessary, the actuarial required contribution. They made assumptions, and then the stock market crashed in 2008, and we got behind the 8 ball. And it's going to take 15 years of responsible budgeting to get ourselves out of this. And I'm committed to making the full ARC payment, that actuarial required contribution, in each and every budget. Next year it's going to be $66 million more than it was this year. I think we can afford that. They're projecting a $219 million surplus next fiscal year, so I think we can afford the ARC payment. But as we move along, as we work with both parties and both houses in the legislature, we're going to have to look at identifying a dedicated source of revenue, some stream of revenue that'll be there each and every budget cycle so that we can make the payment. I'm not talking about a tax increase. I'm just talking about finding a source of revenue in the state budget that we know is going to that so that we can stabilize that system.
And that was my next question. Some people have talked about expanded gaming for that and other ideas. Do you have any idea where you would like to find that dedicated funding?
You know, expanded gaming is one opportunity. Look, as Attorney General, I've cut my office's budget by 40%. I've done more with less. And we can find some efficiencies as well in state government and free up some sources of funding. So there are many different ways. You know, money's fungible in the state budget. We can figure that out. But we are going to have to make that payment going forward because our ability to, you know, our financial ratings and our ability to bond and to build for the future depends on it.
Now, on a legal issue, at the Farm Bureau Forum, that you said that there are some parts of tort reform that the state needs to look at, including out-of-state firms targeting nursing homes within the state. Now, the Chamber has pushed for medical review panels, which would have a panel of 3 doctors that would give an expert review of the evidence and wouldn't block access to the court. Sometimes it might even help the person that's going to court. Would you support something like that?
I don't support medical review panels because I don't think they're constitutional. I think there's significant state constitutional questions with whether or not we can put medical review panels in place. And all you're doing is creating a 3-judge panel of appointees to pre-screen a lawsuit. What I would support are measures and changes to our civil procedure system in the area of nursing home litigation. We do have too many out-of-state firms coming in and doing nothing but a volume business in nursing home cases. So I would support a change in procedures on the front end to make plaintiffs acquire an in-state expert certified to the court on the front end that the case is meritorious and have a preliminary hearing in front of the judge to make certain that cases in nursing home litigation are meritorious before they move forward. I also think, as a matter of state insurance law, that we ought to rate OBGYNs together with every other profession. We shouldn't let our insurance companies come in here and charge higher premiums to OBGYNs because they have a peculiar exposure due to some potential bad outcomes. I think that OBGYNs should be rated for insurance purposes along with neurosurgeons, orthopedic surgeons, and everyone else.
Now, on some competitiveness issues, LIFT, local option sales tax, is something that we've been pushing for. Obviously, it would let voters in a local community decide whether or not they want to raise their sales tax by a small amount in order to build projects in their area. Matt Bevin actually just said recently that he's changed his tune on that a little bit and said that he would be open to thinking about it now and talking about it because there are some communities that have projects that need to be built. How do you feel about that issue? Would you be open to that idea as well?
Well, Matt Bevin seems to change his tune on many issues. I can't figure out what he's for and what he's against sometimes based on his past statements. But Jacqueline, I don't think there's anything wrong with giving the voters in a local community the option to finance a project on a temporary basis if they want to. I think that's entirely reasonable.
And public-private partnerships is another issue that we've been pushing for. Obviously, there's been some back and forth over the Brent Spence Bridge project, and that's what's really holding it up at this point. How do you feel about P3, and would you pass that kind of legislation?
Yes, I support the P3 legislation. I support the P3 legislation that Representative Combs has put forward in the last couple of legislative sessions. I think P3s don't work on every project, but it's an important tool to have in your toolbox in Frankfort when you're trying to get infrastructure projects done. And so I support that legislation. I would advocate for its passage. My opponent's been on record saying that he is against P3 legislation, P3 projects and P3 legislation. And look, we've got a big broadband expansion underway in the state right now, and we're doing it through a public-private partnership. The only way to get a company to build out that fiber, particularly in the rural areas where there aren't a lot of customers, is for state government to say, okay, we're your captive customer for 30 years. You get us and county governments, and you get higher education institutions and the school systems, and we'll agree to a rate, but you build it out over the next 30 years. And that's what we're doing. That's an important public-private partnership. And I think you've got to stand up and support P3s if you want to see projects like that go forward.
Now, on the Brent Spence Bridge project, are you for or against tolling that bridge, and how do we get it done if we don't toll?
Well, I'm not for tolling it. I think that Northern Kentucky needs to come to a consensus on this issue. If you look at what we did here in Louisville with our bridges and the bridges that are now under construction, there was a lot of federal planning money that came in on the front end. And the federal government picked up the initial cost. Now, Indiana and Kentucky had to come along with their road funds and pick up the later costs. And that's what's going to have to happen with the project in Northern Kentucky. But what I haven't seen in Northern Kentucky yet is the federal planning money. And we've got Mitch McConnell on one side of the river, the Senate Majority Leader. You got John Boehner on the other side of the river, the Speaker of the House. Where's the federal planning money to get this project underway? And so Northern Kentucky has not reached a consensus on how they want to finance it. I'm going to keep my ear to the ground. If they want to come up with a financing plan, that's great. But we need to figure out where those two leaders are and getting some federal planning money in here so we can figure out what it's going to cost and how we move forward.
Now, finally, on some energy issues. Obviously, the Clean Power Plan just came down, finally, the final rule. And the state is likely going to have to comply. I know you're going to continue to fight it in the courts, you've said, but are we going to comply, and do we come up with a state plan for this?
Well, I am the only Democratic Attorney General in the country, Jacqueline, to sue the EPA over this particular plan. And if you'll note, just this past summer on one of the lawsuits that we helped file on another EPA rule, the Supreme Court just ruled, it's called the MATS rule, but the Supreme Court just ruled that the EPA had exceeded its mandate, that they didn't do a cost-benefit analysis. So they invalidated the rule and sent it back. So here you have the EPA proposed a rule, a bunch of utilities complied with it and retired some coal-fired generation, and then the Supreme Court comes along and says, no, that's not a legitimate rule. I think that's where we are with the latest Clean Power Plan. The EPA is re-regulating in areas that they've already regulated, and they can't do that under the Clean Air Act. And they're violating their own statute. This rule came about largely because of a lawsuit that other states had filed that wanted to drive up our power costs. Northeastern states filed for this rule because one of the reasons they do it is because we have cheaper power here. Jacqueline, there's a reason we have so many auto plants, and we have so many aluminum smelters and steel plants here in Kentucky. It's because of our low cost of power, and we need to stand up for that. And we need to stand up for our coal communities, particularly in eastern Kentucky. So this is an example of me taking on my own party, putting Kentucky first. I'll always put the people of Kentucky first. And when you say, are we going to have to comply? I don't know. I'm not going to develop a state implementation plan while we have a lawsuit pending. I can tell you that. I can tell you that. And it's always an option not to submit a plan. But as long as we're litigating, and I think we have a good chance of having the courts, especially in light of this recent Supreme Court opinion, we have a good chance of the courts striking down this rule. We're going to continue down this path as long as I'm Attorney General and hopefully when I'm Governor.
Now, is this lawsuit going to be done in time before states have to comply, or else they're subject to the federal?
I hope
compliance?
so. I think we'll certainly have a trial court opinion, I would think, before or out of the D.C. Circuit. Actually, I should back up. We've appealed to the D.C. Circuit, so we should have that initial opinion here before the plan is due. And if we get up against some deadlines, we can always ask the court to stay the EPA's imposed deadline pending the outcome of this litigation, and I think that's entirely reasonable.